Hey guys, welcome to the channel. My name's Jen and I'm here in Melbourne, Florida. Melbourne is zone 10A and today is August 27th, so you can imagine the temperatures are still really high. In the afternoons, we're still averaging in the 90s for a high temperature. But with the rest of the country seemingly starting their fall garden, it's really tempting for us gardeners to try to figure out how we can jumpstart our fall garden when we're still 2 months away from getting down into the low 80s. In today's video, I'm going to share with you some strategies about how we can get started early on a fall garden and how it'll help you extend your fall gardening season. Now I'm going to use my favorite gardening resource, which is the IFAS Planting calendar, to talk through some of the strategy today. Now, even if you're not in Florida, you probably have an extension office in your state that has a planting guide for your specific area, and you can very likely use something similar but geared towards your area. I'll put a link in the description box below to the IFAS Planting calendar, and I'm also going to share several screenshots to help talk through some key points in it. For us here in Florida, fall is prime time for gardening. We finally get temperatures that are cooling down, we get a little bit less pest pressure, and it's not quite as rainy as it is in the spring and the summer. But there's another major difference with gardening that we have here in Florida that I want you to understand. And that is, here in Florida, when we start our fall garden, what we're really trying to do is wait until we get temperatures that are cool enough to not stunt the growth of those plants and not cause bolting for those plants. It seems like the rest of the country is fighting a different battle. What they're doing is looking at their first frost date and backing up from that to find their planting date. They're trying to plant as early as possible so they can get a good harvest before the frost kills off their plants. What I'm going to share today is a few points to keep in mind that will help you get started early, like the northern gardeners, but also not drive you to experience the negative side of plants bolting and stunted growth. Let's start by looking at the columns across the top of the planting calendar. You can see it shows data for North Florida, Central Florida, and South Florida. North is considered all of Florida that's north of State Road 40. Central is considered the part of Florida that's south of State Road 40 and north of State Road 70. And South Florida is considered everything south of State Road 70. And just glancing at the chart, you can see the months vary slightly between those three different regions in Florida. I'm here in Central Florida, so I'll speak today mostly about the Central Florida dates. There's one more column that's sneaky good. It's called the transplantability column. In this column, they have ranked crops 1, 2, and 3 in terms of transplantability. 1 means it's very easily transplanted, which means it's a really good candidate for seed starting. Number 2 means you can transplant it if you're very careful about it. Number 3 means transplanting is probably not recommended unless you have a really well-developed root system in that transplant. Now I want to ask you, and I want to hear you reply in the comments below, what do you think of when you think of fall crops? To me, I'm thinking brassicas and I'm thinking root veggies. So if I were to look at the table and try to figure out the timing for some brassicas that I want to plant, like broccoli, cabbage, and Brussels sprouts, for example, they all say I should be planting between September and February. Now there's also a column for days to harvest where you can see that these plants are going to take 90 to 120 days to mature after germination. But they're also all three ranked number 1 for transplantability. So we have 3 to 4 months before these plants reach maturity, and we have advice that says they transplant well. So my first tip is to get those brassicas started in a seed starting cell or tray. Yesterday I started 2 varieties of cabbage, 1 of Brussels sprouts, and 1 of broccoli. Now the other thing I want you to think about is how often you or your family are going to eat these types of vegetables. So since I started these crops yesterday, which was August 26th, I should have my first harvest at the very end of November, which is still in the planting time frame for those crops. So this is where we need to start thinking about succession sowing. And by that I mean we're going to plant one of those every 2 weeks from now until the end of the planting season, which is February, so we can have continuous harvests of those brassicas and make really good use of that fall garden. So for brassicas, my tip is to go ahead today and start those seeds and plan on starting one of those every 2 weeks. Now let's talk about root veggies. Root veggies are going to be beets, carrots, turnips, radishes. Let's look at the table and see what it says about transplantability. We can see on the planting calendar that beets are rated a number 1. So according to this planting calendar, beets are an option that we could start in a seed starting cell. I started 8 golden beets yesterday. I ordered my golden beet seeds from Jera's Garden. I'll put a link down in the description box below if you're interested in that. But let's talk more about what our strategy is about the other root crops like radish, carrots, and turnips. So let's look back at the planting calendar. Carrots, it says we can direct sow them in the garden in September in Central Florida. Although carrots are rated a number 2, meaning they could be transplanted if you're very careful, I'm planning on direct sowing my carrots this year. I've just heard way too many gardeners talk about the importance of the taproot getting as deep as possible in the early stages after germination, and I don't want to tamper with that taproot. Now, radishes and turnips are rated a number 3 for transplantability, which means we're going to direct sow radishes and turnips. The calendar says we can start direct sowing them in September, although I'm going to hold off for a reason that might surprise you. Today is August 27th, so according to the calendar, I could plant those as early as next week. However, my garden is still full of those summer vegetables like sweet potatoes that I need to harvest and get out of the garden. And then my plan is to amend the soil in my raised bed before I start planting those fall crops. Similar to brassicas, root veggies are also a great option for succession sowing. So ultimately, my strategy for root crops is a 3-pronged approach. Number 1, start today with the seeds in seed starting cells that I can. The data tells me that beets will do well, so that's what I started. Number 2, I'm going to harvest and remove my summer crops out of my raised bed and amend the soil before I direct sow my carrots, radishes, and turnips. The third piece of the puzzle is succession sowing. I'm going to be planting these root veggies every 2 weeks from now until February, maybe March for radishes. Now let's talk about a third category of crops. Those are going to be your big fruiting crops like tomatoes. If we look at the planting calendar, it says we should be able to plant those in the month of September. And they also have a rating of number 1 for transplantability, which means we can go ahead and get them started in seed starting cells today. So yesterday I sowed seeds for 2 different types of tomatoes. I started a Cherokee purple tomato and then I started tomatillos so I can make a salsa verde. Now, a fall garden is not complete unless you have herbs and flowers. So I already have perennial herbs like oregano, thyme, and rosemary in the garden. Those I planted last year and they're still going strong. What I want to get started and ready to transplant in the garden in about October are my annual herbs. So I'm talking about basil, cilantro, dill, parsley, any of those annual herbs that you're interested in growing. Now, I highly recommend starting your seeds today if you want to have some herbs ready to go in the garden in October. The reason I highly recommend starting your herbs today is because take a look at the germination rate of some of those seed packets for herbs. A lot of them don't even germinate for 21 days. Now, a garden is not complete without some flowers in there too. Flowers are going to help attract those pollinators so that you can get some natural pollination on any of your flowering crops. In the past, I've used marigolds, nasturtium, borage, and they all worked out great. But this year, I'm trying to learn a little bit more about the different flower varieties in Florida, and I looked at these infographics that UF IFAS has for flowers to plant in August and September, and I researched a little bit about whether I could use those to attract pollinators in a raised bed, and I was trying to target ones that kind of had a low profile so they could sit nicely on the edge of a raised bed. Although I will say not all the flowers are short. I'm really interested in learning more about the different types of flowers, what they look like, how the bees interact with them, and so I'm purposely trying to grow a large variety of flowers this year. So from the infographics, I chose 4 flowers to put in my raised bed. Number 1 is Crossandra. Number 2 is Moss Rose. Number 3 is Taurinia. And number 4 is Tropical Sage or Salvia. Now, I searched high and low on the internet for some seeds to start these flowers. but I couldn't find them anywhere. And basically, if I did find them, like Crossandra, for example, I found some seeds on Amazon, but they were pretty expensive. And the reviews just talked about how poor the germination rate is. So I looked at my local nursery's online inventory, and sure enough, they have all 4 of those flowers in stock, ready for me to go buy them. So I'll probably make a trip over to the nursery maybe tomorrow or this weekend and buy those starts with the intention of planting them in my raised beds. I'm curious if any of you out there are also trying to expand your knowledge of the flowers we can grow here in Florida, so drop me a comment below if you are. So let's recap my top tips for getting a jump start on your fall garden here in Central Florida. Tip number 1 has to do with brassicas. For brassicas, I recommend starting now, starting indoors, and continuing to sow seeds every 2 weeks. Tip number 2 has to do with root veggies. For root veggies, I recommend starting what you can indoors in a seed starting cell right now. For me, that's beets. Number 2 for root veggies is going to be as soon as you've got your summer vegetables out of the garden, you've amended the soil, and you're within the calendar guidelines for carrots, radishes, and turnips, I recommend direct sowing those seeds. Tip number 3 has to do with herbs. Get those things started in seed starting cells right now. Herbs can be started indoors or outdoors. I'm doing mine indoors simply because it's on the same tray as my brassicas and my root veggies. But what we're trying to do here is get through that 21-day germination and start getting herbs growing. Tip number 4 has to do with flowers. We're going to put flowers in our raised bed, and I suggest that you choose ones that do well in September and October. If this video was helpful for you guys, drop me a like and a comment below, and I'll see you guys next time.